Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel. L'Mitzvah Hashem. Today, we will be learning Daf Kuf Samach Beis Amud Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today the very last word of Kuf Samach Aleph Amud Beis Siman Shin Chaf Vav Sif Tes. Our learning should be a schus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael Hanesunim Bar Tzara Bar Shivya Ha'imdim Bein Bayam Bein Bayabasha Hamakim Yirachem Aleihem. Our learning should be a schus refuah shalema for Yeshua Levi ben Ahuva Malka Chana, Yitzchak ben Tzion ben Dusha, Rivka bas Shiraleah, Chavadasa bas Serel. They should have a refuah shalema b'sai Shachel Yisrael. And in the schus of the limud Torah of Klal Yisrael, the Rebbeinu Shalom should have Rachmanis on Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shalom should protect every member of Klal Yisrael b'chol makom shahem. Continuing to learn lahalachas of rechitza on Shabbos. So yesterday we saw in Sivches where the Mechaber brought down, he discussed kind of a peripheral issue that could come up when dealing with rechitza. He spoke about the question of a person being tovel in a mikveh for tahara purposes, and the peripheral issue was the issue of misaking, like tikkun moneh, even though the Mechaber was discussing a case where somebody's being tovel in a cold or at most a lukewarm or a warm mikveh, where the gzeira against rechitza doesn't apply, still there was this peripheral issue that maybe being tovel in the mikveh for tahara purposes, maybe that would constitute an issue of tikkun moneh. And the Mechaber said, no, it does not, and we discussed it at length in the Mishnah Berurah. Today, in Sivtes, again, the Mechaber is going to bring up some peripheral issues that we may encounter when dealing with rechitza. Says the Mechaber Sivtes, Mutter lirchaitz panav yadav v'raglav. You're allowed to wash your face, your hands, your feet, b'dvarim she'enam mashirim seyar, using some kind of an agent that does not act as a depilatory. It doesn't remove hair. Now, the Mishnah Berurah is going to say that the Mechaber is discussing over here something that sometimes does have the effect of removing hair. So you're washing. I assume from the fact that the Mechaber is saying that you're allowed to wash panav yadav v'raglav, he means that somebody is washing with hot water, shahu chamu miba'od yom. And since it's hot water that was heated on Erev Shabbos, the halacha is you're allowed to use it to wash so long as you wash less than roiv of your body. Now the Mechaber is also mentioning, what if when you're doing this washing, you use some kind of a cosmetic which could have a depilatory effect? It may cause the removal of hair. It's not certain to cause the removal of hair. That's what the Mechaber means when he says, Mutter lirchaitz panav yadav v'raglav b'dvarim she'enam mashirim seyar. You're using something that is not certain to have the effect of removing hair, but it might. You're allowed to use that. Why? Because it's a davar she'eino miskaven. You're not washing using this agent in order to remove hair. You're doing it as an exfoliant. You're doing it in order to cleanse the skin, to give you a nice, healthy glow. That's why you're using this agent, not in order to remove hair. So it's a davar she'eino miskaven. And while sometimes it does have the effect of removing hair, it's not a psik reisha. Since it's not a psik reisha, this is mutter. Now, the Mechaber continues, and he says, not only are you allowed to use these kind of agents, but even mu'uravim in dvarim hamashirim. You could even do that if you also add to whatever you're washing with. You use multiple agents. So you're using hot water, you're using this cosmetic agent, which sometimes acts as a depilatory, and now you're also going to add in some kind of an agent that always acts as a depilatory. You're allowed to wash it that way also, ubelvad shelo yeh haroiv midavar hamashir. So long as the majority of this mixture that you're using to wash is not made up of something that is a depilatory. What's the point? What's going on over here? What's going on over here is very simple. The Mechaber is telling you you're allowed to wash using these agents so long as it's a davar she'eino miskaven and it's not a psik resha. If you add so much of this depilatory ingredient to the mix that now it's going to be the roiv, then already it's going to be a psik resha that it's going to cause the removal of hair, then it would be aser. But so long as that ingredient is less than roiv of the mixture, it's not a psik resha, and therefore this would be mutter. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Lerchaitz pan of Yadav, Hainu afilu yesh lo zakon. This is mutter even if you have a beard. V'hu adin sa'aroshai. Same thing. You're allowed to wash with these agents, even if you have hair on your head and you're washing your head. But of course, we have to take care not to come up against the isser of schita. You can't squeeze the liquid out of your hair. The Mechaber said you're allowed to wash b'dvarim she'enam mashirim seyor. Taken literally, those words mean you're allowed to wash with agents that do not remove hair. Now, there would be no chiddush in that. Why is that a chiddush? Yeah, you could wash with it. Why not? Obviously, what the Mechaber wants to say is she'enam vadai mashirim. What the Mechaber means is you're allowed to wash with an agent where it's not a psik resha. It's not certain that it's going to cause the removal of hair. After lepa'amim hem gam ken mashirim. Even though sometimes it does cause the removal of hair. Afilo hachi mutter, this is still mutter. Kevedu ein miskaven lazeh. Since this is davar she'ein miskaven, he's not trying to remove hair. Elo letzachzeach atzmai belvad. All he's trying to do is use some kind of an abrasive so that he cleans his skin very well. This is what we would call an exfoliant, something that's going to scrape off dead skin cells, take off dirt, and give him a nice, healthy glow. That's l'tzachtzeach atzmai. The Kamel and Rabbi Shimon, we paskel like Rabbi Shimon, the davar she'ein miskaven mutter, something which is a davar she'ein miskaven is mutter, so long as it is not a psik resha. Ois cotton chavzayin, you're allowed to add an ingredient that is a debilatory, as long as shelo yiyeh haroiv, as long as that ingredient is not the majority of the mixture that you're using to wash your face. Hatam, why is it usher if it's the roiv? Does psik resha, because then it's going to become a psik resha, and it's going to become a vadai, that you're going to cause the removal of hair. V'asher mishum goizes, removing hair is an issa daraisa. It would be the malacha of goizes, which is literally shearing, shearing. Av she'eina miskaven l'kol yalma, even though it's still a davar she'eina miskaven. But since it's a psik resha, it would be aser. Moving along to Sif Yud, second line down, middle of the line, Kosamach Beis Amud Aleph, says the Mechaber. Mutter lerchaitz yadav b'mursan. You're allowed to wash your hands with bran. Okay, back in the day, you couldn't go to the supermarket and pick from 350 different types of soap. They used very primitive types of soap, which were probably a lot more effective and certainly a lot healthier than the nonsense that we use nowadays. One of the things that they would use to wash with was bran. Bran acts as an exfoliant. It's somewhat of a mild abrasive. So if you wash your skin, if you mix it with water and you wash with it, it's going to clean your skin very, very well. Now, if you want to wash using mursan, so you're going to take water and you're going to add bran, now you're going to come up against issues of lush, of kneading, Kneading. So says the Mechaber, mutter lerchaitz yadav b'mursan. You're allowed to wash your hands using mursan. You're allowed to wash your hands using bran. Again, the Mechaber is talking about using hot water, so you can't wash roiv of your body, but you could wash pan of yadav or raglav. You could wash a small area on your body. The chiddush of the Mechaber over here is the lush issue. It's mutter to do this, and we don't need to be concerned about lush. Why not? The Mishnah Berurah is going to explain that. First, let's go weiter in the Ramah. The Ramah really touches upon lush right away. The Ramah says, Hagah, the reason this is mutter and it's not a problem of lush is the gibul kala achar yad, because yes, you might be bringing about a certain amount of lush, but it's kala achar yad. You're doing it with a shinui. You're not doing it in the normal way. We'll explain all of this in a moment. You know what? Let's pause over here and take a look at the Mishnah Berurah, because that's really the bulk of the rest of today's share. Says the Mishnah Berurah, you're allowed to wash your hands using bran. V'uadin panov, same halacha would apply to your face. The point is you're allowed to do this so long as you're doing it not on roiv of your body, because you're using hot water, that would be usher. You could wash your face with it, and you could do this av sheyesh lo zakon, even if you have a beard. The mursan hu davar she'ein meisher seyar, because mursan bran is not going to be a debilitary. It's not going to cause any hair to come out. So there's going to be no issue of goizes. Umutter l'shavshef bahen, and you could even rub the water with the bran. You could even rub it into your face, into your hands, on your beard. It's not a depilatory. It's not a psik ratio that you're going to remove hair. There's no issue here. Varak, however, the caveat is, tzarich lizar, we have to take care, shelo ya'arev mitchila hamursan b'mayim. While the mechaber is telling you that you're allowed to wash using bran, what you're not allowed to do is, you can't take a bowl of bran and add water to it, because now you're going to come up against lush, mishum lisha. That would be a lush issue. Ella, what you are allowed to do, what the mechaber is being matir is, yikachem biyadav haretuvais mimayim. What you could do is, you could take a basin of water, you could put your hands into the water, then take your nice wet hands and take a scoopful of bran, and now start to rub on your face and everything else. That you're allowed to do. But you're not allowed to add mayim to the morsan. Adding mayim to the morsan, that's already going to be a lush issue. And we'll explain this more. Let's go weiter. So, now, even though when you do this, you're going to cause a certain amount of lush. When you take your hands and they're wet and they have water on them, and now you scoop up bran and you start rubbing, you're going to do lush. You're going to end up combining some of the water with some of the bran, so a certain amount of lush is going to take place. Nevertheless, says the Mishnah Berurah, ein lachush. That's not a problem. That's what the Mechaber and the Ramah are being matir. Why? The gibel kala achayadhu, because this is gibel with a shinui. V'zeu shemasayim haramah, and that's what the Ramah means to say here when he says the gibel kala achayad shari. The Ramah is coming to explain the Mechaber. And the Mechaber says, yes, you could wash your hands with morsan. Can you add the water to the morsan? No, that would be lush. Can you take your wet hands and scoop up morsan? Yes, you can. You're going to cause a certain amount of lush? Yes, but it's lush kala achayad, and therefore it is mutter. Continues the Mishnah Berurah, even though we learned earlier that you're not allowed to do this kind of gibel with morsan, even with a shinui, we're supposed to be machmer not to do this on Shabbos. Erev Shabbos. Really, we want you to add water to the morsan on Erev Shabbos in order for this to be mutter. Nevertheless, in our case, we are not pouring the water onto the morsan. All you're doing is picking up the morsan with wet hands. Mutter l'divrei hakoil. This is mutter according to everybody. So let's dive a little bit deeper into this shaila, and let's do the math. Let's figure out what's going on over here. So in Shin Chav Dalid and Shin Chav Aleph, we learned the halachas of lush in great detail. Now, when we learned the halachas of lush, we learned that there are two different types of dry ingredients. There are dry ingredients that we refer to as bar gibel. Those are dry ingredients that are susceptible to lush. When you add a liquid agent to them and you combine them, they truly combine, and they truly combine to produce something new. So when you take flour and you add water and you knead it, you don't still have dry pieces mixed in with water. No, the water and the flour completely combine in order to produce a dough. So flour is a bar gibel. Flour is something which does become kneaded. Bran is what we call a davar she'enoi bar gibel. It doesn't truly combine through the introduction of a liquid agent. It doesn't really combine into something new, into a dough. All that happens is the individual dry pieces end up getting clumped together because of the liquid agent. Once the liquid agent dries up, it really falls apart again. So it never truly combines into a dough. This is what we call an Einoi Bar Gibel. Now, the Mechaber paskins like the Rambam. The Rambam holds that by a davar she'einoi bar gibel, like bran, like mursan, there's never an issue of lush midaraisa. Since it's an einoi bar gibel, really midaraisa, there is no malacha of lush. The malacha of lush only applies to something which is a bar gibel. Bran is not a bar gibel, there's no lush daraisa. But what there is an Issa D'Rabbanan. What's the Issa D'Rabbanan? A Gzeira. We don't allow you to do lush on something which is an Einoi Bar Gibel, because if we do, you might come to do lush midaraisa by something that is a Bar Gibel. Once we understand that, and we understand the sheet of the Mechaber, that the Mechaber paskins like that Rambam, it's easier to understand what the Mechaber just said. The Mechaber said, you can go ahead and you can wash by wetting your hands, and then taking bran and using bran to scrub with. You're going to cause a certain amount of lush. A certain amount of the bran is going to become combined through the introduction of the liquid, of the water that's on your hands. Yeah, but let's do the math. Since we're dealing with Mursan, and Mursan is an Einor Bar Gibel, and since the Mechaber paskins like the Rambam, at worst, the only thing you can have here is an Issa D'Rabbanan. Even if you would mamish take water and mamish add water to the mursan and mamish go ahead and knead it, it would only be an Issa D'Rabbanan. Are you doing that? No, you're not doing that. What you're doing is totally a shinui. All you're doing is you're scooping up mursan with wet hands and you're scrubbing with it. At worst, that's lush with a shinui. So it's lush with a big shinui, and it's on something which is an Einor Bar Gibel, which at worst could only be an Issa D'Rabbanan. Says the Mechaber and the Ramah that we're willing to be matir. Now, the Mishnah Berurah said over here, he pointed out, Va'ava pi sheyesh lahachmir shelo legabel al filu al yidei shinu b'Shabbos. The Mishnah Berurah says, wait a second. Really, we learned earlier that even this, lechatchila, we're not matir on Shabbos. Why not? So if you go back to Shin Chaf Daled, I'll remind you what it says over there. There is another shita in the Rishonim. There's a shita that disagrees with the Rambam. There's a shita in the Rishonim that holds that in one way, something like Mursan, which is Einoi Bar Gibel, is actually more chamor than flour, which is a Bar Gibel. How is that? This shita holds that by something like Mursan, which is an Einoi Bar Gibel, simply adding water to the mursan is automatically an Issa D'Oraisa. Why? Because they reason. If you're dealing with something like flour, which is a Bar Gibel, then adding water to it is not lush. Why? Because you didn't accomplish complete lush. By flour, when you add water to the flour, that's not lush. Lush is adding the water to the flour and then kneading it. That's lush. But by something like Mursan, which is an Einoi Bar Gibel, just adding water to it is going to accomplish all you could possibly accomplish. And therefore, they hold that simply adding water to Mursan is already lush b'daraisa. The Mishnah Berurah said over there in Shin Chaf Daled that really we should be chayshish for that opinion. Now, if we're going to be chayshish for that opinion, then over here, we would not be so quick to be matir, using wet hands to go ahead and rub the mursan, because we would be afraid that is lush. However, what the Mishnah Berurah says over here is, over here we could be makel, because over here you're not doing this in the ordinary way at all. You're not adding water to the mursan. You're only picking it up with wet hands, and therefore even this shita would be makel. Okay. Let's go weiter over here to 3 lines off the bottom. Near the beginning of the line says the Ramah. Va'asar lirchaitz yadav b'melach. We learned this halacha earlier. You're not allowed to scoop up salt. This does not mean salt water. This means salt. You're not allowed to scoop up salt and use salt to clean your hands. We learned this halacha earlier. The reason for it is, you know what? Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. You're not allowed to use salt to wash your hands. The reason is something we're going to learn shortly. When you use salt to clean your hands and you rub it together, the salt melts and it produces moisture. It produces water. I remember when we learned this the first time, I brought down the Aruch HaShulchan. The Aruch HaShulchan says we have no idea what this is talking about. Our salt doesn't do this, but apparently salt back in the day, somehow if you rubbed it together, it would turn into some kind of water. And that's a problem of moilid. You're going ahead and you're creating something that was not here before. Before you had dry salt. Now you rub it together and suddenly you have water. So you're being moilid something. You're creating something on Shabbos, and that looks like a malacha. It looks like creating something. But to wash your hands with brine, to wash your hands with salt water, shari l'kuli alma, everybody would agree that that's mutter. To wash your hands with salt water, you're not being moiled anything. There's water here now. There was water here before. You're not being moiled anything. The problem is using dry salt that's going to turn into water. Continues the Ramah. 3 lines off the bottom, about 2/3 of the way through the line. V'cholsh kein b'boiris shekairin zaif, b'lashon Ashkenaz. Certainly, you cannot use soap. This is talking about a solid soap, like a solid bar of soap. You cannot use soap. We'll get to the Mishnah Berurah in a moment. Let's continue. Oy b'shar chelev, or any other kind of fat or tallow, something that is solid that they would use as a cleaning agent. You can't use that shenimuach al yadav, because when you take a bar of soap and you get wet and you start rubbing it, what happens? The soap, the solid soap, breaks down and turns into a liquid. So again, you're being moiled the liquid. Before you had a solid, now you have a liquid. That's a problem. The heavy noilud. And when he says heavy noilud, really it means it's moiled. You are creating something that was not here before. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. It says the Mishnah is cut lamid. The heavy noilud. V'dami l'risuk sheleg ubarad shenispar le'el b'simin shenchaf she'aser gam kein mitam zeh. What the Chavetz Chaim compares this to is we learned the halacha earlier. You're not allowed to scoop up snow or scoop up ice and grind it down into water. Because again, you're being moiled mayim. You have snow, you're turning it into water. You have ice, you're turning it into water. You're being moiled mayim, you're not allowed to do that. The Magen Avram brings down a Shilte Gibarim that's Mekel and is matter this. What's the rationale? The Svir Lahu, because they hold, the Masha Asr Chazal Arasik Sheleg Ubarad, when the Chazal said that it's usher to grind up snow or hail and turn it into water, really, the reason they did this was Gzeira Midrabanan. The Chachamim looked and they said, look, are you allowed to take an orange and squeeze out orange juice? No, you're not allowed to do that. By the same token, you're not allowed to take snow and grind it and squeeze out water. Because if we're going to let you take the snow and squeeze it or grind it down to water, you might come to take an orange and squeeze it down to juice. And both of them are oimid lamashkin. If you're dealing with a fruit that's meant to be squeezed, it's oimid lamashkin. The snow is also oimid lamashkin. The purpose, what could you do with the snow? Well, you could turn it down into water, right? Back in the day, snow was a major source of water. So that's why the Magen Avram says this is aser. Now, if that's why it's aser to grind sheleg and barad, soap is not oimid lamashkin. The point of soap is not to reduce it to liquid. The point of soap is to clean yourself. Yes, when you use soap, you break it down to liquid, but it's not oimid lamashkin. When you look at a bar of soap, what's the purpose of that bar of soap? To squeeze it or melt it down and get liquid? No, the point is to use it to clean yourself. So therefore, they reason that you're not going to aser solid soap the same way you're going to aser sheleg ubarad. However, so he says over here in the name of these shitas v'im kain boiris u'shar chelu she'enam oimdem lamashkin mutter lechatchila. Really lechatchila they should be mutter. However, says the Mishnah Berurah, there's other problems. Vayin b'Sefer Tiferes Yisrael. Take a look at the Sefer Tiferes Yisrael. Shekasav writes the b'boirish shalanu, by our soap shehiraka, which is relatively soft. L'kulei aser mishum memachik. You have another problem when it comes to soap, and that is that when you wash with soap, you smooth out the bar of soap, right? And by doing so, you're coming up against the Issa Daraisa of Mamachik, of smoothing. In Shin Yudal, we learned that you're not allowed to take soft wax and stick it into the hole of a barrel and smooth it out, because that would be mamachik. Well, to take a bar of soap and wet it and rub it around, you're going to smooth out the bar of soap, and it would be also because of mamachik. He says that there's another problem. Besides mamachik, that you're going to smooth out the bar of soap, there's also mimareach. What's mimareach? Mimareach is taking a viscous substance and rubbing it, smearing it. Mimareach is smearing. And they're putting forth here that there could also be an issue of mimareach when you use soap, where when it's still somewhat thick, you're smearing it on your body, so you could have an issue of memachik, you're smoothing out the bar of soap, and also mimareach. V'yesh lahazir ha'amal zeh ma'oid ad kan l'shoynoi. V'levad kol zeh mashba b'Rashi daf nun amud beis, the boiris masher aseyar. Rashi brings out another problem, and he says that the boiris that they used to have was a depilatory, and it was a psik ratio to use it, because it definitely would remove hair. So that would be another reason to answer this. Halacha l'maisa, we definitely do not use bar soap on Shabbos because of memachik, mimareach. So we certainly do not use bar soap on Shabbos. When it comes to liquid soap, the topic of liquid soap is a complex machlokes haposkim. Rav Moshe Zechariah Kodesh Levracha did not like the use of liquid soap. Not 100% clear as to exactly why. Is it because when you use liquid soap, you have a liquid, then you start using it and it lathers up? That could be a moilid issue. Before you had a liquid, and now you have this lather that you want to use to clean your body, so you're moilid the lather. Also, it seems that he wants to say that you take a very small amount of liquid soap, you mix it with water, you rub it, and you get a tremendous amount of lather, which means that in a certain sense, what you're doing is you're spreading out the liquid soap, right? Before it was only this much. Now suddenly it's this much. So in a sense, you're spreading it out, and it could be that that's some sort of a memareach issue. Be that as it may, the Rishiva Zatzal did not like the use of liquid soap. Rabbi Yashuv was mater liquid soap. So it's a machlokes haposkim, and you should ask your LOR for a psak whether or not you should use liquid soap, and if you should use liquid soap, should you dilute it, how much should you thin it out, etc., etc. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ulavad kol, did I do this? Ulavad kol zeh mashma Rashi daf nun amud beis, the boris masher aseir, v'cheikas v'ran, v'cheidu minik kol Yisrael, lahachmer bazeh. We're going to stop over here. We'll continue next time with Sif Yud Aleph. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The source of limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Ron Shem should send Yeshua for us, Paras and Sheduchim to those in need. We should be zayich to see the BS Gold Tzedek. B'mherav Yameinu Amen. Be well.